Okay, so this is the Bible study for Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 through 18. And the text says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me." So remember that you can download PDF copies at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us as we study this text. Number one says, what does Paul say about the Philippians in verse 12? They were the kind of Christians that were always up and down and made a pastor worry about their eternal future and whether they would remain faithful when he was away. B, they have always obeyed. C, they have obeyed not only in Paul's presence, but also in his absence. So he's going to give an instruction, sort of a command to the people in Philippi. And as he gives that instruction, he's saying, I want you to obey now as you have always obeyed. And so he has a confidence and sort of is basing his request and instruction. And I think the way that he speaks to them suggests that he has confidence that they will do what he says, because they always have. They've done what God called them to do when Paul preached it, when Paul instructed them. They did it. They weren't up and down. He didn't have to worry. And the way I phrased um, I want you to consider um, as a part of the church that your pastor, your pastors, your Sunday school teacher, your uh, people that care about you and care about your faith, um, they want you to succeed. They want you to be victorious. We want you to grow in your faith, to live out the faith that God has begun to work in you, and we care about that. That matters to us, and therefore, I think some people have spoken negatively about the church being judgmental and things like that. But I'll say this: that if I care about your growth, then I will be evaluating whether I think you're growing. Because the only way I can accomplish, if I feel like I'm a part of your growth, then the only way I can tell whether I'm being successful, whether I'm accomplishing my goals and my calling from God, is when I watch um, whether you are accomplishing God's goals for you, whether you are, and I have to evaluate. And so judge has a negative connotation. Evaluate can have a positive connotation, although not uh, always. I think sometimes I don't want to be evaluated either. But um, I say all this to say that when you think somebody's being judgmental, they may be evaluating and considering whether there's something more that they need to do to pour into your life and care for you. But all of that to be said, um, we do have a sense whether you are somebody who is growing in your faith and sort of soaking up every possible thing that would help you grow and putting into practice some things that would help you grow, or whether you're somebody who hears something that we say and rolls your eyes and says, "Oh, Pastor Pete always just wants me to be in church. He's I don't have to be in church to be a Christian." And we're evaluating. I'm evaluating. I won't speak for anybody else. I'm evaluating your attitude toward the growth that God wants to bring about in your life. And that then I know whether you're the sort of person um, that um, will be growing even if I am not pushing. So there's some people that are seeking out devotional materials and classes and ways to grow, and they're doing it all on their own, and they don't need to be pushed. And then there are other people that seem to avoid every opportunity to grow in their faith, and so um, Paul is calling out to the Philippians to give them another command, give them another instruction, give them something that he thinks that they should do as a next step in their faith. And he is pointing out as he's doing so that he knows they are a people that have always obeyed, that are trying to grow, and that don't just do what is right when he's around, but do what is right even when he's away. And I don't want to um, I want to just, I think that I said all that because um, everybody kind of has this attitude in our culture. Uh, you can't judge me. And they get the head moving and everything. And who do you think you are to decide whether I'm a Christian or not, or whether I'm a good Christian, or whether I'm growing? Or, well, honestly, you know what? You do not have to submit to my leadership at all. You have the choice to go to any church or no church. This is America, it's a free country. But if you have chosen to be a part of the church that I have been called to shepherd, then you should not be surprised if I am trying to help you grow, and in doing so, evaluating whether the things that I'm doing to help you grow are being effective or not, evaluating whether I could do something better to help you grow, evaluating whether it is, this is going to sound bad, but honestly, whether it is worth my time and effort to try to do more to help you grow, or whether you've already decided you're not interested in growing to begin with. And you, everything that I tell you, you sort of brush off or ignore. Well, I could try something else, but you're not listening to me, so I might not. Um, and all of that is evaluating how I think you're doing spiritually and how I think you're growing. I'm not God. I don't get to judge. I don't get to decide whether you're in heaven or not. But it's actually my job to do what I just described, to evaluate. Um, and if I was doing that in a non-religious context, if I was doing that in a school and I gave you grades based on what you've learned or not learned, based on my assessments and evaluations, then nobody would think twice. Everybody would be okay with it because that's the context in which, in our society, for now at least, it's still okay to evaluate people. But in the religious context, we've decided that that's not okay. And I'll just say this, that you do not have to submit to my evaluation. But I don't believe my evaluation is wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm perfect and it's always right. I'm saying the fact that I am evaluating. I don't think it's wrong for me to do that. And I don't feel like I don't think we should be apologizing for judgment quite as much as we are apologizing. So maybe that was a little bit beyond the question, but Paul is given his evaluation. Now, the fact that it's a positive evaluation, maybe you don't care if I evaluate you as long as I come out with a positive evaluation. That's the way we tend to. We don't call it judgment uh, when it's positive. We only call it judgment and get mad about it when it's negative, and seems to evaluate that we could do better. Um, Perhaps we would accept that a little better from others if we evaluated ourselves in an honest manner and realized that yes, we could do better, and I know I could do better. Um, Number two, can your Christian walk be described this way? This is what I'm asking now is let's do some self-evaluation. Are you somebody that your pastor could say about you? I know that you've always been obedient to God. I know that you've always listened to instruction in Christian principles and Christian living, both when I'm there and I see you and when I'm gone and I don't see you. Is that what people would say of you? Is that what my evaluation or your Sunday school teacher's evaluation might be of you? Or can you honestly say, perhaps when you look at your life, I'm not sure that could ever have been said about me. I think that I could do better at being the kind of person that grows spiritually, follows the leadings of God, and becomes all that He wants me to be, and doesn't have to be constantly prodded even by the pastor. Number three, what does Paul tell these faithful Christians who have obeyed even in his absence in verses 12 and 13? A, you have been doing well and working so hard. Why don't you just relax for a little while? I think you know that that's not what he says. B, continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. That's what he says. But now, much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. So this is the command that he is calling them now to obey as they have always obeyed. Um, be careful. Don't give up. Don't relax. Don't get complacent. Continue to be very serious. When it says fear and trembling, it's saying take seriously your salvation to the point where you are evaluating it. You are looking at whether, I just think it's amazing. And in the church, there are some people, the most holy people that I know, when I have an altar call, will hit the altar every time. Somebody asked me one time, Pastor Pete, I don't think you do enough altar calls. You haven't done many altar calls. And an honest truth is, yeah, I haven't done near as many since COVID. There was a time where we couldn't slobber on the altar together. And we're kind of, I think, getting back to the altar now. The altar is symbolic. Somebody can respond to a message without coming to the altar. We can give a challenge at the end of the message for us to be different. I answered that I think first and foremost by saying the thing that sickens me the most as a pastor is people that are at the altar every time there's an altar call, but they go away unchanged. And I don't want to make this a laughing stock that people come to the altar, but they don't actually get right with God. They don't actually change anything in their life. They have a cathartic experience. So that sickens me that has become a thing in the church, that people allow sin to remain in their life, go back and forth, back to the altar, back to the altar, back to the altar. The pastor gets praised for an altar call. Everybody thinks that guy's so spiritual because he keeps coming to the altar. But the reality is he's um riddled with guilt because he continuously sins, lives a life of rebellion against God that God has called him to turn away from, to go and sin no more, if you will. And he keeps doing it, but he feels good every time he comes to the altar, and that cathartic experience is almost like a drug, and it becomes a pattern in people's lives. I've seen it, particularly, well, I think in any ministry. I was going to say particularly in the type of ministry that we do, but I've seen it in every ministry. Um, all that being said, the people that do come to the altar are often the most holy people, the ones that respond to every single teaching, that evaluate themselves critically and say, man, I could do better, even when they're doing wonderfully. And I think, man, these are the people that are growing in the Lord the most. They're going to hit the altar every time. And then there's 100 people out there that should have been at the altar that didn't come to the altar, and I don't know what to do. We had a staff member at one time that started calling people by name. You know, you ought to be here. That's generally frowned upon when pastors do that. But just calling out names, saying, you know, you should be here too. And so we generally don't do that. But anyway, um, but those people that are always at the altar because they're that sensitive to God's moving and God's spirit, and evaluating themselves in a way that they realize they could do better, are people that are generally working out their salvation with fear and trembling. um so anyway, when I'm not opposed to altar calls. I love the altar, I love altar calls, but I don't do them regularly. I don't do them every week, because I find that the two people that end up at the altar are the people that are not really changing, and the people that are doing the best at self-evaluation already. And the people that need most to come to the altar do not come to the altar. The people that need most to come and actually change do not come and change. So I've tried other response calls, to try to get those who need to respond to consider their response in the coming week. That's just a thought. See, God works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Just in case you thought you were in it alone, you were tired, or you didn't even feel like you wanted to do the right thing anymore. So he says, continue to work out your salvation in with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So he says, you've been obedient, but continue to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. And remember that God is at work, and he is working in you to will and to act. So in other words, he's trying to change your heart, which is your desires, your will, and your actions, which is what you do because in response to that desire. Now I'll say this, that if your desires inside of you desire something evil and contrary to God, you can still act according to the will of God. You can still choose, and that's called withstanding temptation. And by the power of God, you can withstand temptation. For he has not given you, allowed you to be tempted beyond what you can bear, but he provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. That's what scripture says. So you can stand up to your own desires when you're tempted to do something contrary to the will of God. However, God is also at work in you, changing your desires. And that's not to say that we'll ever get to the place where we don't desire anything that might be contrary to the will of God. I think that would be unbiblical to say that, because Jesus prayed in the garden that the cup be taken from him, because he desired something that was contrary to the will of God, but ultimately he surrendered to the will of God in the midst of that temptation. So I'll say all that to say that you have the power to overcome temptation by the will of God, by the power of God. And he is working in you both to will and to act. So he's working on two different things. He does change our desires. For instance, there are some things that I desire that are contrary to the will of God that so far he has not taken from me. There are other things that I believe are contrary to the will of God that I just don't desire anymore. There was one time a struggle where I still desired cigarettes, and I believe those were contrary to the will of God for me. I don't desire those anymore. Um, so there are some things he's just changed my will. I want his will. There are other things that I hope he changes my will. I hope that it is not as much of um, a fight to overcome and choose to do the will of God in other things as it used to be, but there is still temptation. Number 4, what does Paul tell them and us in verse 14? Do everything without grumbling or arguing. I feel like I just need to leave that set there for a minute. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. I wonder if we just wrote this on our mirror, bathroom mirror, on our rear view car mirror, on our windshield. That's probably not safe, but it might be helpful. And we just wrote that, do everything without grumbling or arguing. What if we had a reminder? I think I got one of those smart watches. It's not as smart as some of your watches are because it's just the smart that I can afford. But I got one of those smart watches, and every now and then I'll be sitting someplace. It's the weirdest thing, and it says, time to get up, or it says, take deep breaths, your blood pressure's gone up, or your pulse rate, or whatever, and it tells me when it's time to get up and walk. You've been sitting way too long, or it tells me you're too stressed. You need to calm down, take some deep breaths. And on this watch is telling me what to do. I wish this watch, when I got amped up and I'm like, well, what are you doing? It said, do everything. I wish it could just say that. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Oh, yeah. I was about to grumble. I was about to argue. I am tempted in this moment to do that. I have a choice. I need to be reminded that I have a choice whether I'm going to grumble and argue or whether I'm not. I'm tempted right now, but I have a choice. And sometimes we just need that reminder. I wish on my watch it would remind me. What might be helpful? Where might you write that to sort of stick it in your head so that you get a reminder when you're tempted? Number 5 says, what according to verse 15 will be the result of our work without grumbling, so that you may become blameless and pure. And then this is in quotes as if from another source. Deuteronomy 32:5 is what my Bible has the reference. It's from another source, so that you may be blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. So that we may become blameless and pure. The result of us not grumbling or arguing, of us doing the work of obeying God without grumbling or arguing, will be that we may become blameless and pure, that we may become children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation, that we will then shine among this generation like stars in the sky. So this is what he's saying. He's saying, if you want to become blameless, if you really want to be the pure, blameless person that God has called you and created you to be, then do his will without grumbling or arguing. Then do what God tells you to do. And do it even when people are bugging you and you don't you don't grumble or you don't argue. You don't give in to the things you want to do because you're so selfish, because you have that selfish inclination. Instead, you 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 choose to do this with joy, to obey God with joy and have peace in your heart. And if you do that, you will be blameless and pure. You'll be children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation, and you will shine among this generation. In other words, you will look different because nobody does this. The pagans, the heathens, the people that don't know God and don't want to know God, they don't act like this. Honestly, the people who call themselves Christians don't act like this. So you will shine as a person of God if you do everything without grumbling or arguing. You will be different. You'll be different from everyone around you. Now, a lot of us have this tendency to make excuses for grumbling and arguing, or for doing all sorts of stuff that we shouldn't do as Christians, and then say, well, all Christians do this. Everybody does this. Um, that's that's not um, that's not what God is looking for. God is looking for somebody to be different. So if all Christians do this, then they're not different. But if you do it, you'll be different, not only than the people that don't know God at all, but you'll be different from most people who call themselves Christians. And you will show people, they'll say, man, I can't stand the church. I can't stand Christians. They do this, they do that. And they're like, but there's something different about you. And you can say, I don't want to be judgmental of everybody else. I can't speak for them, but I'm going to be about me. This What's going on in my heart is what should be going on in all Christians. God is changing me, and it's not easy for me to be this way, but God has given me the strength because he works in me to will and to act. Number 6, what might this suggest are characteristics of this warped and crooked generation and us, even if we do the right thing but are always grumbling and arguing, that we should not take on if we are blameless and pure and stand out from those around us. So this is taking this and sort of building upon it. Hey, it seems like if you do the right thing, it's the right thing, regardless of how you do it. That's not what this text says. Do the right thing, do the will of God, and do it without grumbling or complaining or arguing, and you will be different. And you will stand out in this generation. B, what should not be a part of us and what is a part of this warped and crooked generation is grumbling and selfishness. It shouldn't be a part of us, but it is a part of this generation. And if we do the right thing, but do it in sort of a self-centered way, expecting recognition, grumbling if people don't recognize it, arguing if it doesn't turn out the way we want, that's all selfishness. And we're the same as the generation around us if we act like that. See, people who do what they're supposed to for the applause of men, like doing the right thing only when Paul is with them. So he says, "You guys haven't been like that. You've done things even when I'm not here." Some people in this generation do things only when the pastor's around, and that's the way this generation is. D, it seems like people must do the right thing for the wrong reasons and resent it because they don't get credit or wish they didn't have to do it, when God really wants to change our heart and our desires and work in us to both to will and to act. See also Psalm 37:4. So brings it back around that part of the grumbling comes because our will hasn't been changed. We're doing the right thing, but something inside of us still wants something different. We're selfish. Psalm 37:4 says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So some people quote that for sort of a name it, claim it, grab it, stab it sort of theology. God wants to give me a Cadillac sort of theology. But what that really says is, if you delight yourself in the Lord, then God will give you the desires of your heart, because the Lord is the desire of your heart. So if you begin to love God, he will give you what you love, more of him. And so that's the answer to happiness. It's the answer to joy in our life, is when we stop wanting all these things that destroy us, frankly, and we begin to want God. And that's the one thing he will never hold back from us, is more of him. And so that selfishness, wanting to pile things on ourselves, is not going to get us to the right place. But if God changes our desires, he changes our will, then he will give us what we want. But that's because what we want is more of him. He's not going to give us those same things that were destroying us and damaging to us that he didn't give us before, because he didn't want us to have. He's going to give us the new things we desire now that we understand how much he loves us. And that's maybe a shift in thinking for many of us. Number 7, what is Paul's personal stake in their obedience, according to verses 16 and 17? A, none. What does he care? It's their lives. That's not what it says. B, he admits to the human desire to see his ministry mean something in the end, that he might be able to boast on the day of Christ in the fruit of his ministry. So it says, as you hold firmly to the word of life, and then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run the labor in vain. But so he first says that if you remain faithful, if you obey, if you do what I'm saying, then when I get there, I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh, I just spent all these years of my life ministering to people who ultimately did not end up in heaven anyway, because they were so selfish and they didn't listen to anything that I said, which sometimes feels like sort of the plight of the pastor. It sometimes feels like the curse of ministry. It's when when God calls Isaiah and says, I'm sending you to a people that will be ever hearing, ever seeing, and never perceiving. They're not going to listen to you. They'll hear what you say, but they're not going to do anything. That's what that's a terrible call. And sometimes we as pastors feel like that must be God. That's what God's called me to do. Nobody's listening to me. I've joked before. I had somebody one time come to me, how does it feel to hold the congregation in the palm of your hand? And he must have thought more of my preaching than most people do, I guess. Because I just looked at him and I said, I don't know. I've never experienced that. I've experienced, I got one family in the church that every three sentences they're back and forth to the bathroom. I got 4 or 5 ladies in the church that sleep through the whole sermon. I got 8 or 10 people in the church that are on their phone the whole time. So I really don't know what it's like to hold the congregation in the palm of my hand. I know what it's like to bang my head against a brick wall and feel like nobody's listening. And so that sounded like complaining, but that's not my intent. So Paul is saying, man, I want to know that I didn't do all this for nothing. I want to see you succeed, you have victory, you do what God's called you to do. And then on that day, the day of Christ, I can look and say, look, this is what I lived for. Then he says, so let's go to see. He alludes to failure or feelings of failure or waste that he might feel if those for whom he had sacrificed so much did not continue in the faith, and every pastor has felt that way. And then D, he remembers also. So this is the correction to what our natural feelings are. He remembers also that if he is poured out and his effort seems wasted, just an offering given to God with no fruit, that will be okay too. And ultimately, all of us as pastors and as Christians that are giving our lives for others have to come to that place where we're okay if it makes no difference, that it was all just an offering to God. Obviously, we want to see what we're doing make a difference in somebody's life. But ultimately, we shouldn't be giving up if it doesn't, because it was an offering poured out for God. And so we consider our temptations towards selfishness too, and we do this ministry without grumbling or arguing. Well, it's good to be with you. Consider this, reflect, allow God to change you. Be one of those who considers our lives and evaluates ourselves.